Hello and welcome to In Her Time, brought to you by Amnesty International Zimbabwe. My name is Nicole Madziwa and I'm your host today. And joining me in studio is Rachel Jambo, the Gender and Intersectional Justice Campaigner at Amnesty International Zimbabwe. And today we are going to be discussing, in fact, we're starting a 4-part series on sexual reproductive health in Zimbabwe. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
This is exciting because, as I mentioned earlier, that we're commemorating Women's Month,
Yes.
Which then just makes me dive to my, to my first question: why are we doing this today? And maybe if you can give us also a brief history of the Women's Month commemorations.
Okay, thank you for that. So when we're talking about the Women's Month, this movement is something that started back in the 20th century following the it was spurred on by the universal female suffrage movement. It started off as a labor movement. However, by 1975, the United Nations had acknowledged 8 March as the day to celebrate the International Women's Day. And so when we talk about the women's movement, it dates all the way back to the 20th century, and it originally started following the suffrage movement in the labor unions in Europe. But however, by 1975, the United Nations had expanded. First of all, it acknowledged 8 March as the day, the International Women's Day, where we hold the commemorations, and has also extended the different areas that matter to women to cover social, political rights, and now even to climate and environmental rights. And then at the top of the women's agenda is economic, financial, and educational empowerment, issues that matter as well, women and girls leadership, including cultural and political achievements, also access to affordable healthcare and sexual reproductive health services, poverty eradication, and also the eradication of gender-based violence. So the World Economic Forum estimated that it's going to take 131 years for the global community to achieve gender justice, which is a long time. It's a very long time. The theme for this year is accelerate action towards gender justice. And we feel, as Amnesty International, this is a very topical theme, given that we need 131 years for women to catch up to where the men are. And also given our contextual background, in Zimbabwe, latest statistics coming in from the Ministry of Health and Childcare, they said between January and June in 2023, about more than 6,000 children aged between 10 and 14 fell pregnant and dropped out of school. In the same period, more than 50,000 young girls aged between 14 and 19 fell pregnant and dropped out of school. And then most recently, this past week, the ministry also shared statistics that 54 maternal deaths were recorded just in January, and 299 neonatal deaths were also recorded. So I guess it speaks to the crisis that we have in Zimbabwe vis-a-vis the women's movement, and I think that's why we're here today. And what has emerged in our line of work with as Amnesty, what has emerged is child marriage is one of the issues that are propagating, or rather that are playing a huge role in keeping women and girls back in the women's movement. Yes.
Beautiful stuff. So basically what Amnesty International Zimbabwe is doing is ensuring that women are not left behind, and they're also on board, and also taking care of, or addressing issues rather, that affect women on their day-to-day basis in their spaces. Yes, you mentioned about child marriages as being at the core of what you're doing currently at this point. What are child marriages, for the benefit of our viewers that are watching right now?
Okay.
I know we know this, hearing it from other people,
Yes.
but what are child marriages?
All right, so the legal definition of a child marriage is a union, be it informal or a formal, be it a civil union, between an individual and a minor. And who is a minor? A minor is anyone below the age of 18 years old. So if you are married to someone below the below the age of 18 years, then that is indeed a child marriage.
Okay, so and from the work that you've done as Amnesty International Zimbabwe, what are the causes of child marriages in our societies?
Okay, so I think to start off as a disclaimer, we need to just put it out there that we do know and acknowledge that there's no child who volunteers themselves into marriage, and no child has the legal capacity to consent to marriage. What we do have is a lot of victims of circumstance, victims of society, and broadly speaking, when we talk about drivers of child marriages, they can be categorized into three sections. We have religious drivers, societal drivers, and economic drivers. So, and then also we need to take note that a lot of child marriages occur in rural areas, rural communities, and also economically marginalized communities. So when we talk about the religious aspect, there's certain religious and cultural practices that propagate child marriages. We are not at liberty to pinpoint and name names, but we are aware that there's certain religious sects in the country that advocate for child marriages. I've been in communities where you hear a man as old as 65 years old saying no. When a child is 15 years old, she's ripe and ready for marriage. But that is a child, it's a 15-year-old, and some of these marriages are condoned because they're viewed as, the child needs spiritual leadership. It's in keeping with the doctrine of the church. So we have all these justifications coming in from the religious sector to accommodate marrying off minors. And then looking at the societal issue, marriage is viewed firstly as a solution to teenage pregnancies. The statistics I shared earlier, the more than 6,000 10-year-olds getting pregnant, more than 50,000 aged between 14 and 19. These are all children, adolescents. And in our culture, we know this. If you get pregnant, the norm is pack up your bags and go to your husband. So that is also one of the leading causes behind child marriages, because young children are engaging in sexual activity at a very young age. And I suppose this is something we'll also cover as part of the series, but just maybe to mention it for it to bring more weight to my point right now. We have something called the Public Health Act in Zimbabwe, which is outdated. The Public Health Act stipulates that anyone who's a minor cannot walk into a medical facility and get any sexual reproductive health services, that be it contraception, anything to do with that. So if we're saying this is the exact same demographic that is extremely sexually active, yet they don't have access to critical contraception, then obviously there's going to be pregnancies. And then when there's pregnancies, parents are going to sell their children off into marriage. Why? To keep the name of the family intact. So there's no shame and all that, And what's worrying, coming back to child marriages, is that statistics show that 34% of girls marry before the age of 18 versus 5% of boys that marry before the age of 18, which means the major perpetrator isn't really the young boys, it's older men, And then last but not least, poverty is a huge driver towards child marriages. I've been in communities in Manicaland. Last year we hosted the International Day of the Girl Child in Marange there, and at one point hearing stories from little girls saying, you know what, we don't have money at home, and in the event that my father decides he needs money, I'm the one who's going to be forced to drop out of school, and I'll be married off, and my brother will carry on. Right. These are touching stories. These are hurtful stories. These are conversations that we should not be having in the 21st century,
Absolutely.
When we're talking about empowering the girl child. So again, poverty is leaving the girl child being viewed as a cash cow, as an emergency loan, and these are things that are happening, especially in rural areas where parents have gone back, they've regressed to prioritizing empowering the boy child over the girl child. So these are some of the drivers we've identified.
Okay, and as an organization, what sort of projects and how do you incorporate communities? Because there is the religious sect, which is very strong. I mean, we're a very Christian or religious nation for that matter. So you have the religious sect, and you also have families that say, okay, this is what we think. Kana mwana kanumburiswa anofana kurorwa kwa kanumburiswa, despite that maybe this person has like 5 or 6 wives, and this is a minor.
Yes.
How do you find the balance?
That's a very interesting question, and it is something we're constantly challenging ourselves within the office as to how to best program to be more creative and innovative and to balance, like you mentioned, the different interests. So I think to start off, Amnesty International, we are a human rights-based organization. We advocate for the end of human rights abuses in their various forms. So specifically on my desk is gender and intersectional justice, and the campaign that we're running is called End Fistula Restore Dignity campaign. I'll get more into more detail about the campaign in another segment. But so what we do is, I think our strength is in human rights education. I think a lot of people do not know, or a lot of families rather, they don't know that they will be infringing upon the rights of a child until they are told, you know.
Right.
And like I mentioned, the demographic of some of these things are happening in rural and economically marginalized communities, where if you were to go to them and tell them, for example, do you know that a girl child has the right to choose when to get married, who to get married to?
Absolutely.
They don't believe in that, you know. So what we do is we at community level, we try and raise as much awareness as possible. We raise awareness of human rights, specifically related to sexual reproductive health, specifically related to child marriages and the impact these have on the child. Because if we're talking about, like you rightfully mentioned, a child is married off, it doesn't end with a lobola ceremony.
Absolutely.
That's one thing we keep trying to have both. So it's a tiered approach. It's not just so even at community level, we target the traditional leaders, the community leaders, be it church leaders, active members of the community. We target the parents as well, and we also target the children themselves, so that, you know, it's balanced. The information is being shared across the board. So like I was saying, it doesn't end with lobola. That starts a never-ending cycle of human rights abuses, because if a child is married off at 15, she's going to be solely dependent on her husband for the rest of her life. What happens to her right to education? What happens to her right to access medical facilities? Because if you're married off at 15 and you get pregnant, chances are highly likely you won't go and give birth in a medical facility, because they'll look at your record and see that you're underage. You're a minor. And then that's going to land your husband in prison.
Absolutely.
So what?
I hear that, Rachel. So we'll take a quick break, and when we return, we will continue looking into the campaigns that Amnesty International Zimbabwe has been doing to combat child marriages in Zimbabwe. Stay tuned.
Hey everybody, my name is Taff and I am your host every Tuesday at 2 p.m. for Mental Health Watch Show, where we discuss everything mental health. And you know what? We make it so simple. We break down the big terms and make it palatable for you and I to understand, and so as much as to reduce the stigma. So do join us every Tuesday at 2 p.m. You know the place to be. It's Mental Health Watch on Heart and Soul.
Welcome back to Inner Time, brought to you by Amnesty International Zimbabwe. I'm your host, Nicole Madziwa. And before we went for the break, I have this beautiful guest that I have in studio today, and we're doing a 4-part series on sexual reproductive health in Zimbabwe, and super exciting considering that we are commemorating Women's Month, and today we're talking about child marriages. So before we went to the break, I'm sure if you just joined us, we're talking about child marriages and the campaigns actually that Amnesty International is doing in the communities, you know, bringing together various sects in our communities to sort of like put everyone on board on the dangers of child marriages and what child marriages are, because sometimes ignorance is not bliss, unfortunately. So you can't say, I did not know marrying a 15-year-old was child marriage, but be warned. Be warned, it's actually a crime. So that's what we're talking about today, and we're talking about the campaigns. So Rachel, maybe if you can take us into the campaigns specifically that you guys are doing in communities.
Awesome, thank you, Nicole. So I'll be very brief. So all right, so I think I mentioned briefly in the previous segment, but so the campaign that we're doing centered on women's issues is called End Fistula Restore Dignity campaign. And this campaign, whilst it does not specifically deal with the issue issue of child marriage cases, it does incorporate the element of child marriages as we look into the issues of access to sexual reproductive health services in Zimbabwe. Our approach, it's tiered. We have awareness initiatives and human rights education with various stakeholders, including the communities on the ground. And then we also have an advocacy aspect where we do engage duty bearers such as members of parliament, different and relative line ministries, all in an aim to bring everyone onto the same page so we have the same discourse and we understand how child marriages, or rather lack of access to sexual reproductive health, is linked to child marriages, which inadvertently leads to the abuse of human rights for the victims of these unions. Yes.
Okay, so so I can see that you're working with the lawmakers, you're working with the community itself. So what do you have to say? What message would you have for these religious sects, whom we shall not name, who are, propelling these child marriages, who are condoning these child marriages? Even the parents are condoning these child marriages. So what message do you have?
All right, I think it's very emotional. So I think what I can say to community leaders, to church leaders, to leaders in any type of a capacity, before we become part and parcel of a lot of these practices that see young girls being sold off into marriage at a young age, let's remember Memory Machaya. She made headlines a few years ago. She was married off and died in child labor at the age of 14 years old. Let's remember Nokutenda Waramba. She was married off she was married off and died during child labor at the age of 15 years old. What parent would want to hear or receive a call that their 15-year-old child died in child labor? Yes. This is all coming from a system that is failing to protect the girl child, a system that is failing to expose rapists, because sex between a minor and an adult, that is rape. It's not sex, it's rape. So I think we need to do better. Going back to what you mentioned, that we are a religious country, are we really a religious country? So, yeah.
For me personally, from that question, I would say we are a church. We are a country that goes to church, different churches, but we don't fear God. That's what I would say. But on that, lastly, my question would have to be: You've mentioned so many things that you're doing, and even the statistics, like where is globally where the world is in then achieving equality between men and women. How is Zimbabwe in terms of that? How are we doing in terms of addressing women issues that affect women and the girl child, and issues such as child marriages? How far are we? Are you getting support from the communities as you're doing these different projects?
Okay, right, thank you. So I think maybe to start off, I do want to just celebrate the strides that we've made as a country, the strides that our government and our policymakers have made to put provisions in place and frameworks in place to protect women and to protect girls. Starting with the Constitution, we have Section 78, 26 and 56. Basically, these provisions just work to protect minors, and they criminalize any type of sexual conduct with this. So the legal age of majority is 18 according to the Constitution. Therefore, sex or marriage with anyone below the age of 18 is an offense. So that is a very good start, first step, in the journey. Then we go to the Marriage Act. Again, the Marriage Act has been recently aligned with the Constitution to set the legal age of consenting to marriage at 18. So we cannot marry off 16-year-olds anymore because they don't have legal capacity to consent to marriage according to our laws. We also go to our customary Marriage Act, where it now requires all unions to be registered, which again is good. It's checks and balances. When you go to the registrar, he's going to ask for your IDs, and if this one is a minor, you can't. However, there's still gaps, because according to the Customary Marriage Act, lobola is not yet a requirement. So that leaves a huge gap where families amongst themselves, they exchange lobola, and for them that's marriage, outside of the checks and balances in our legal provisions. Last but not least, we have the Protection of Children and Young Persons Act, which was passed in July last year,
Yeah.
something that we celebrated heavily last year. What this act basically does, it criminalizes sexual activity, sexual conduct, marriage, or anything sexually related with a minor. And although we're still, having more conversations about some of the gaps, like for example, despite this act being there, minors are still being married off, going back to certain religious practices without impunity. So it goes back to, how do we balance between allowing people to freely take part in all of their religious and cultural practices versus what is in the best interest of the child. And our constitution says at all costs, or at any point in time, you put the interests of the child, the best interest of the child, supersede all else. But on the ground, this is not happening. So there's that gap with certain practices that continue without impunity. Then number two, how do we for victims of child marriages, those that are already in marriage, that have been sold off before this bill was put in place, there's no mechanisms in place to dissolve those marriages. There's no mechanisms in place to rescue those children from those unions. So those are still some of the gaps that we are seeing in our legal frameworks. But however, I think on a broader scale, we are making very positive strides towards achieving gender equity, protecting the girl child, protecting women's rights.
Right. That's beautiful stuff that Amnesty International Zimbabwe is doing. I can tell that it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it takes a whole village to end such issues, because you need the lawmakers, you need the traditional healers, which I know we touched a little bit on it. We need the church itself, we need different religions, in fact, the whole community, to make sure and to ensure that we end child marriages. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being with us here today. Thank you so much, viewers, for tuning in to this week's edition of In Her Time. I'm your host, Nicole Madziwa. Join us again next week as we continue on this 4-part series brought to you by Amnesty International Zimbabwe. Goodbye.